The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody. 2 months ago, this subcommittee held a hearing on Somalia that revealed the extent of the suffering from what witnesses agreed was the worst drought in the Horn of Africa since the 1950s. Our hearing today is in part a follow-up to that July 7th hearing in order to examine the U.S. Agency for International Development's long-term strategy to address the humanitarian crises in East Africa, such as the current devastating drought. The need for this continued focus on the region is apparent given the ongoing, very disturbing reports that we are receiving about Sudanese attacks on its Blue Nile state that will drive residents into South Sudan and reports of theft of international food aid. We know that an estimated 13.1 million people are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance, and every month that number goes up. The United States to date has devoted a total of $604.6 million in humanitarian assistance funding for the Horn of Africa. At the same time, our government has devoted $370 million in fiscal year 2011 to help the newly independent government of South Sudan respond to the crisis largely caused by the Republic of Sudan attacks that have sent people streaming into this young nation. The drought in East Africa apparently is part of a persistent weather trend in the region, but there is disagreement on the extent to which La Nina or El Nino weather phenomena will affect weather patterns in East Africa over time. The current La Nina phenomenon, which began in August of 2010, results in wetter than normal conditions in Australia and parts of Asia from December to February, and drier than normal conditions over equatorial East Africa over the same period, leading to the current drought in the region. But while drought is one reason for food shortages, it is exacerbated by stagnating agricultural development and unsustainable forms of livelihood. In our July 7th hearing, Nancy Lindborg, Assistant Administrator in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, raised the issue of the long-term need for changes in livelihoods in the region. She quoted a local cattle herder as saying, quote, "We are seeing the end of the pastoral lifestyle as we know it." In countries across the region, Ms. Lindborg testified, nomads are without water and pasture and unable to migrate safely. Many of them are left without assets or income, and as they migrate out of rural areas to urban areas, they strain an already stressed situation. There are nomads in Africa from Western Sahara to Sudan. If weather conditions have conspired to end what in some cases are livelihoods developed over millennia, who will work with these pastoralists to develop new ways of surviving? Part of our humanitarian strategy, therefore, must involve working with African governments on developing viable strategies for helping nomads transition into new livelihoods that fit their skills and are sustainable in often resource-poor conditions. In the long run, donors will be increasingly less likely to continue to support people suffering through repeated droughts in the same areas. We must break this cycle now and help them to find durable solutions for the future. In Somalia, the hardest hit country in the region, the terrorist group Al-Shabaab has obstructed the delivery of humanitarian assistance and directly threatened aid agencies. It has also interrogated aid workers and accused them of spying for the West or proselytizing. Maritime policy and the hijacking of aid shipments has also hindered the provision of aid. By late 2009, threats against humanitarian workers and attacks against aid compounds had driven many international groups out of Al-Shabaab-controlled areas. Most of the remaining groups left southern Somalia in 2010. The result has been an estimated 2.2 million people in southern Somalia, representing some 60% of those who remain in the country in need of aid, but currently out of reach of most aid agencies. We face serious questions about how to meet the desperate needs of people like those living in areas controlled by Al-Shabaab. We want to prevent terrorist organizations from benefiting from humanitarian aid, but we must balance this concern with our deep desire to keep alive those needing food, water, and medicine. There has to be a solution that not only prevents aid from going to terrorists, but also prevents the terrorists from perpetrating further violence against their own people by denying them access to life-saving food assistance. We don't want food being used as a weapon, as we learned so bitterly. Meanwhile, our government is helping the new government of South Sudan to as well as containing conflicts that are likely to erupt. This new government is learning to handle the normal business of establishing a government, even as an estimated 371,455 people other states in the 30th year. Flight of thousands of the Republic of Sudan to the north. Our assistance to the new government was as a democratically elected institution and help enable it to address such crises. Empowerment should be our focus as we will help this new government take its place among the world's nations. Drought and other natural disasters and man-made catastrophes due to conflict have been a persistent story in East Africa. In an era of limited resources, we must encourage adapted lifestyles, develop strategies for delivering aid in conflict areas, and enable our partner governments to manage crises more successfully. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses. I thank them in advance for taking the time to be here to share their expertise and their recommendations. And I would like to yield my friend and colleague, Mr. Payne, for any time he would like to consume.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this a very important hearing on what is surely the worst humanitarian crisis facing the world today. Prior to our recess, we had several meetings dealing with this issue. However, we are continuing to see the crisis continue. And this crisis is indeed the worst in a generation, affecting food security for more than 12 million people across Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Kenya. Many of us remember the famines in Ethiopia and in that region for many years, beginning in the 60s when they started to come at about a 10-year frequency. There was the drought of the 60s, early in the 60s, then in the early 70s, and the drought in the 80s, and then when we went into Somalia in the early 90s, and we all recall the Black Hawk Down, which ended that particular era when we went in to try to feed the children. Back in the 70s cycle, I went to Wallo Province with French and German pilots to deal with the 73 drought, and out of the city of Dessie in Wallo Province in Ethiopia, when we saw millions of people who were mobile, and we had to locate them by planes and then drop food to wherever we could find them. We called it the Mobile Million. We saw that we needed to do better planning. And once again, we see that the situation is continuing, and the international community was very slow to respond then, resulting in more than 1 million deaths that cycle. Then, of course, we started to do better planning, and we started to project when famines would come, and would try to pre-position our supplies. And actually, probably this situation would be even much worse, even as bad as it is, had it not been for some pre-positioning by USAID and the UN predicting that this drought was coming. We now face a worsening humanitarian disaster that threatens to take even more lives. The scope and scale of today's crisis is virtually unprecedented. As crops have failed and livestock have died, food prices have soared in the past year. In addition, poor infrastructure, insecurity, and internal unrest have compounded the problem facing the region. Somalia, where drought conditions have exacerbated a long-term complex emergency, is a country hardest hit by the disaster. An Islamic insurgency led by al-Shabaab complicates the delivery of international aid to famine-struck areas. On July 20, the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Somalia issued a famine declaration in 2 regions of southern Somalia. Now all south and central regions of Somalia are in the midst of this famine, including regions that used to be the breadbasket of the country, like the Juba Valley. Nearly half of Somalia's population, some 3.7 million people, have been impacted. Over 2.4 million, located mostly in the south central region, have fled their homes in search of food and water. Nearly 900,000 of these men, women, and children have fled into neighboring nations, greatly straining their already insufficient resources. The road to camps in northern Kenya and eastern Ethiopia have been described as roads of death. Thousands of women, children, and elderly are left on the side of the road, unable to continue, resting on those who have already died. Those fortunate enough to reach the camps find them filled beyond capacity with horrendous sanitary conditions and a lack of food. The international community have recognized the magnitude of the crisis. The World Food Program is currently feeding 8 million people, with more to be accessed in the coming weeks. The UN Central Emergency Response Fund has granted $51.3 million for the region. The Organization of Islamic Conference met last week and pledged $350 million to Somalia. The African Union matched this amount with $300 million coming from the African Development Bank. The United States has contributed over $604 million in humanitarian assistance so far this year, with nearly 70% of it going to emergency food aid. Despite these considerable efforts by the international community to respond to the crisis, there remains a significant funding shortfall. The UN has issued an appeal for $2.5 billion US. Funding to date has been approximately $1.1 billion, leaving $1.4 billion short. The needs of these affected are expected to increase in the coming months, with emergency conditions expected to persist well into 2012. First, we must make every effort to get the life-saving aid to these people who are desperately in need, especially those who are trapped inside al-Shabaab-controlled territory in southern Somalia. That is why I joined with my colleague Steve Cohen and other members in sending a letter to the State Department requesting that licensing restrictions be lifted for NGOs desperately trying to access the most hard-to-reach areas, those under al-Shabaab control. The licensing restrictions were lifted, but it is still unclear whether the aid is reaching those living in the Shabaab-held territories. As the United States and the international community attempt to pull these populations back from the brink, long-term investments are needed, such as disaster risk reduction strategies and helping communities diversify their livelihoods, adapt to climate change conditions, and build resilience to face inevitable future crises. In July, I introduced H-Res 361, calling attention to the crisis, encouraging the United States and other donors to take a long-term strategic approach to addressing the root causes of the crisis, and urging all parties to allow assistance to flow to the most vulnerable populations. Resolution has more than 50 co-sponsors, and many of our colleagues have been deeply concerned and vocal on the issue, including our chairman, Jim McGovern, Joanne Emerson, Rosa DeLaura, Steve Cohen, Barbara Lee, Maxine Warner, Gwen Moore, and Leader Pelosi, many others. Yet, in the face of the graphic depictions of starving women and children, many in Congress have proposed deep cuts to our international affairs budget that could cripple the ability to provide even basic emergency responses. Levels of funding proposed by the House Appropriations Committee will make it difficult to meet both short and long-term needs and emergencies even today, as long as the preventative programs we need to put in place. I know that Chairman Smith is also concerned about this issue, and we hope to work with him and his colleagues to ensure that adequate funding, in spite of our difficult times here, are put forth to deal with the crisis. In regard to South Sudan, I was very pleased to be at the independence celebration in Juba and have followed closely the development in South Sudan. Of course, we're still concerned about Abyei, disputed territory, South Kordofan, where belligerents are still at each other, and the South Blue Nile. We have to resolve these issues so that Sudan can move forward, and we have to remember that Darfur still remains unresolved. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for joining us today. I certainly look forward to your testimony. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Chair recognizes the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I'm going to pass so that we have time to get straight to the witnesses. Thank you.
Mr. Kernan, gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am going to submit my opening statement for the record, too, so we can get on to our witnesses. And again, thank you for holding this important hearing today.
Thank you, my friend. I'd like to now introduce our first witness, Ms. Jandalaya, who has served as the USAID's Deputy Administrator for Africa since October of 2010. In that capacity, she oversees the offices of Sudan Programs and East African Affairs. Prior to joining USAID, Ms. Jandalaya worked as a senior advisor and head of the Peace and Security Division in the Department of State Office of the United States Special Envoy to Sudan. Ms. Jandalaya is an expert on national security with a focus on war-to-peace transitions and public policy reforms in countries affected by conflict. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Mr. Payne, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today about East Africa. It's always an honor and a pleasure to have an opportunity to discuss our work in Africa. I request the chair recognize the written testimony.
Without objection, your full statement will be made a part of the record.
Thank you. As many of you have mentioned, the worst drought in over half a century has left 12.7 million East Africans in need of emergency humanitarian assistance. Under the leadership of President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and our Administrator Shaw, the U.S. government, in coordination with the international community, is delivering emergency food assistance to help local populations in the worst affected areas of Ethiopia, Kenya, and parts of Somalia. The assistance immediately concerns about local food, nutritional support to malnourished children, water, and other essential services save lives. East Africa has two faces. A face of conflict, security, and corruption is one of many know best. But there is another, one of hope, progress, and promise, and we try to balance in our work how to manage both at the same time. Recently, Deputy Administrator Don Steinberg, Assistant Administrator Nancy Lindberg testified on the complexities of providing and delivering assistance in humanitarian crises such as this, when we're dealing with both conflict issues, local tensions within the communities, and the cross-border issues of ongoing military situation. Today I'm here to discuss with you about our continued development engagement in the region, which has helped many people experiencing rising incomes, improved health, and better education opportunities for their children. USAID's ongoing work has bolstered by strong policy and diplomacy, serves a crucial force to lessen the severity of the humanitarian crisis we're facing. Our work has a long-term view into the regions to development in order to work with our host country governments, national regional organization, and the broader international community with the focus on health, agricultural productivity, environmental stewardship, and conflict mitigation, with the emphasis on empowering people to participate in democratic processes in their country. Recognizing the potential of 342 million people in East Africa, USAID is investing $3 billion in development assistance in FY 2011. While this is a significant amount, it's far less than what we might need to spend in future humanitarian crises in absence of our concerted support for development. Our belief is that long-term food security and stability is key to lessening the impact of recurring crises such as the one we're facing today. Our focus is to strengthen early warning systems in the region, build resiliency, as mentioned by the chairman, in communities through livelihood support, safety net investments, and implement measures to help populations and communities adapt to climate change, and prevent conflict over resources by underlying issues of fragility that gives rise to violence. Most importantly, we hope to unlock the enormous potential of African agriculture as the driver of prosperity through the Feed the Future initiative that the President has announced, and our continued engagement with the governments at national and local levels to advance a reform agenda that takes into consideration how to prevent future disasters and how to mitigate the impact on their populations. We see a difference in the impact of the drought in Ethiopia and Kenya on one hand and Somalia on the other. More than 40% of Somalia's 9.8 million people are in crises, and the famine expected to only get worse. It expanded to 3 regions this week, and we're seeing a very different situation in Ethiopia and Kenya. There is a need both in Ethiopia and Kenya, to be sure, but also one of resilience. 6% of their combined population is at risk, while the situation is grave in Somalia, and we do expect it to deteriorate. Ethiopia serves as an important example of USAID's development assistance, working in hand with the humanitarian, which has helped to generate the resiliency that mitigates the humanitarian experience. Land and natural resources that allow them to have these climate change. USAID and its Kenyan partners are exploring innovative ways for new energy systems and have a high cost of applications in rural areas for limited access to electricity. Although Somalia has lacked a functioning central government for over 2 decades, Somalia has been remarkably resilient to difficult circumstances. I was recently in Somaliland a few weeks ago, and the enormous effort of people there to provide for themselves with the assistance that they've received shows a great commitment on what we can do in terms of when there is stability. In other parts of Somalia, we have a USAID transition initiatives to bridge the between immediate humanitarian assistance and longer-term development programs. In areas of relative stability, our assistance has helped nearly 200,000 children in schools, 41,000 communities have access to water, and nearly 10,000 youth in livelihood programs. We continue to look for opportunities for relative stability to empower the population. USAID focuses on these issues in Somalia because where we find opportunities with communities, we're able to build community cohesion and security for those communities when they have value, when they've invested in their own communities and see that there is a future. I would like to turn to the other part of our work, which is countries like Sudan, which have emerging from conflict. And I would like to acknowledge it was a pleasure to have the opportunity to travel with Mr. Payne to the inauguration on July 9th for the emergence of the new country. USAID has been present in Sudan since 1958. Since 2005, after the signing of the CPA, we've worked in South Sudan to help the ministries establish a new government, deliver social services, work with local populations to mitigate conflict, and in the post-independence era, we hope to continue our commitment, and we are implementing a 2-year transition strategy that has an overall goal of increasing stability in the post-CPA period in South Sudan. That does not take away from the ongoing commitment we have made to encourage both parties to continue to negotiate and resolve the outstanding issues that are still remaining from the CPA. We see South Sudan's development policy change around 5 key issues: transparency, accountability, and reconciliation for good governance, development given the enormous need ahead, sound natural resources and revenue management based both on the oil and non-oil potential that rests with the country, delivery of social services, and creating an enable environment for private sector investments. We're working with the international community to build a broad coalition so that the government can build confidence with its own population that it can deliver on their aspirations. The U.S. government is committed to continuing to work with the Republic of the South Sudan in efforts to build a new country and deliver the needs of its people. As we assist the government, we're also working to plan an international engagement conference for South Sudan that allows us to hear from them their development vision and their priorities and how they hope to move forward in the next few years. Mr. Chairman, this year USAID celebrates 50 years of generosity of the American people. We believe we can make a world a better and safer place if we use our wealth, expertise, and our values and invest wisely. Each of the countries I've discussed today presents a combination of hope, accomplishment, and a challenge. And the region itself is a balance of all of that at the moment. United States overall investment goes far beyond the immediate, and we continue to work with you and look forward to having a discussion on East Africa today and in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jandalaya, thank you very much for your testimony and for the very detailed, extended testimony you have provided. It gives us a great deal of information, and the subcommittee certainly needs that. Let me ask you just a couple of questions. You know, in our July hearing on Somalia, the USAID made it very clear that FuseNet famine early warning system made it clear that there was a famine, perhaps, or a drought certainly, on its way, and as early as last year. We knew that, and our government was able to pre-position food. But in your opinion, was the handoff of that information to taking action done as swiftly as it could or should have been? Or were there gaps somewhere that we could learn from? So, you know, if there were gaps, it doesn't happen again.
Okay. We have worked over the last year with our FuseNet colleagues, our international partners, tracking the situation. And I think we've done an enormous effort, we've put in an enormous effort into reaching out to informing host country governments, partners in the region, the UN agencies, to see how we can jointly work together on this. I'm sure there are some things that we can improve on, and however, but our biggest constraint continues to be working with host country governments and advancing and working with them to strengthen and respond to their population.
We seem to have been taken by at least some surprise by the severity and pervasiveness of the famine. Was it more than what the FuseNet and some of the analyses that went into what might be coming their way, or did we just miss something?
I think the failure of the rains in the first October, November, that was recognized, and then the recent poor rains in June, July has intensified the problem that we've been dealing with. But it is a difficult situation that we're having to deal with.
I guess what I'm getting at, was there anywhere along the chain of
Yeah.
command where good, actionable information might have been missed about the severity of this drought? And if there wasn't, please say so.
As far as our colleagues tell us, that we were able to take that information and turn it into an action plan, to preposition, to inform, to educate, and seek access immediately to get to those areas, and find creative ways, such as voucher programs, to see how we can be creative in how we deliver assistance in this circumstance.
Now, on the voucher programs, have you found that empowering people, particularly with work, so they can buy locally grown foodstuffs, is preferable to then just bringing food in? Is that one of the reasons why some of it was stolen in the first place?
I think
Because it was in competition with local merchants?
I think we're dealing with, it's a multi-tack process. One is delivering food, the other is vouchers. So we're trying to find as many different ways that we could minimize the impact of this crisis on the population.
But,
And sometimes, our visibility into what's going on into these communities also restricts us on how we track this. So we're working on a monitoring and a system with our partners on the ground.
is there any analysis about whether or not more vouchers are needed rather than less?
Currently, we have $8 million in our voucher program, and we've launched it. So we're now assessing with our teams, how do we expand it? What are the consequences of this program vis-a-vis other types of assistance we're delivering? And if there's room for improvement in how we roll this, expand this type of activity out.
Okay. When will those kinds of decisions made?
We're in discussions at the moment, so we should come back to you and your staff within the next
That would be very helpful.
week or
Let me
so.
ask you about licensing. I think everyone on this committee is very concerned about the fact that non-U.S. supported NGOs who have people on the ground, partners with whom they can collaborate with, they've been given a general verbal, you won't be prosecuted. But why hasn't that translated into a durable statement of, something in hand where the NGOs will not be fearful of prosecution? And who would make that decision? And will it be made, in your view, soon? Because it seems to me we're losing an asset on the ground to feed hungry people because of a concern that somehow we might be aiding and abetting al-Shabaab.
No, I think we're committed to trying to get as many different partners to take part in this effort to minimize the impact and with the population. We're committed, and our colleagues at the State Department and Treasury are currently working to see how we can review the situation on a case-by-case basis. And I think we can provide additional information in the coming weeks. These discussions are ongoing at the moment in the administration regarding
But is the problem the Treasury Department? Are they the ones who are objecting to USAID's requests for? It seems to me that with this drought and its consequences growing worse by the moment, why wouldn't we want to just get this done today, for example?
The discussions are ongoing at the moment amongst all of us in the with aid, treasury, and state, and we're trying to balance what's the impact, even if we move forward, what are the issues of access and security. So we'd be able to give additional information as these conversations conclude.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, where is the bottleneck? Is it at Treasury? Is USAID actively advocating for, the provision of those licenses to these NGOs, especially since they have people on the ground who, know the risks and are indigenous Somalians in most cases, willing to get that food, but there may have to be some collaboration, some contact with Al-Shabaab, and they fear prosecution. It seems to me, take that off the table, and you talked about opportunities a moment ago, a new opportunity for relief will find its way to those people.
I think our State Department colleagues have spent a lot of time with the diaspora community as well as our leadership, trying to identify where the opportunities exist and what kind of a process we need to put in place. And I think the discussions are ongoing.
Okay, but again, I'm trying to get at where the bottleneck is. Is it Treasury?
I couldn't say, sir, because we're still
NSC?
continuing the discussions.
Okay, I do think, there is a great deal of support, certainly on this subcommittee, for, ensuring that those licenses are granted ASAP, and I would say today, with an exclamation point.
I'll take that.
Please do.
I will.
I would think that a call from the Secretary of State to whoever may be the bottleneck at Treasury, if that's where it's at, could undo a huge, long pipeline of discussions that could mean more dead or severely hurt people. So please take that back, and if you could apprise us soon as to what you find out.
Yes.
In his testimony, Ken Hill of World Vision says that the U.S. response to the worst drought in the Horn of Africa in 60 years is only 60% of what it was for the 2008 drought in the region. And so my question is, there is, according to what the UN has said is needed, about $1 billion funding gap. I know in all past crises, I've been here 31 years, and no matter who's at, in the White House or in at State Department, at USAID, money is often in something as catastrophic as this, drawn down from multiple spigots, as you're doing, and from multiple accounts. Is there going to be an effort to draw down additional dollars and hopefully get it back to those sources later, but where to meet this emergency crisis? I mean, $600 million, we're all happy and grateful for that, but it seems that there needs to be more. And secondly, if I could, I know Saudi Arabia has stepped up with somewhat $60 million. I might be wrong on that number. But is there a move to try to get our Persian Gulf allies, who might have much more suasion with Al-Shabaab leaders, to use their diplomatic efforts to open up more areas so people can get food and medicine?
On the first issue about funding, there will be a mini summit on the Horn of Africa at the UNGA, on the sidelines of UNGA, in the next 2 weeks. And part of that discussion is discussing about the current status of the appeal that's been put out by the UN agencies. The other issue is also what our partners in the region. Turkey has stepped up. The OIC partners have stepped up. Saudi Arabia. So what we're trying to see is how can the UN harness all of these funding sources to account for what the gap is. So there is currently an ongoing assessment that we're working with our UN partners to assess where the funding gaps are, given that the non-DAC, the non-traditional partners have also provided leadership in providing their own funding to the situation. So in the next, we can come back to you once we have a better picture on that gap analysis, and then we're able to adjust our funding accordingly. But we wanted to really work with and take advantage and leverage all these other funding partners that traditionally have provided leadership and stepped up in this situation. I know Turkey is wanting to work with us to see how we can coordinate programs. AU is working with us. So we really try to see what the actual picture of the gap is, because for us, it's not the funding at the moment, it's access and security. But even if it is funding, how do we account for all these other non-traditional partners, and how do we take advantage of theirs, and see how we can use their money in areas that we can't use our monies and sources of funding. That's the discussion we're having with our UN colleagues at the moment.
Finally, in Dadaab, the world's largest refugee camp, what is being done to ensure that sex trafficking, sex for food, and other kind of gender-based violence is hopefully being stopped, and where there is a violence, where those who have committed it have been held to account and the victims given assistance?
I know that our colleagues at PRM at State, our own gender advisor, Carla Coppell, has been out there, and we're working, the coping mechanisms that the people in the refugee camps has turned, is led to some behavior about frustration and leading to, some of the protection issues that we're dealing with. So what we have done is to see how we can work with the UNHCR and the Kenyan government and other partners to see how better we can put a protection and see how we can deal with the gender-based violence. And that is a priority for us. As you know, Deputy Steinberg of the agency has made a commitment to this, and we are currently working to see what systems, what policies, and what programs we need to put in place into those camps to address that. It's a major worry for us, and given that it leaves this population much more vulnerable than other situations we've seen around the world.
I would ask one, I probably didn't phrase it as a question, but do you anticipate further drawdown from various accounts to exceed the $600 million on the near term, and how much do you anticipate will be needed in the next several months?
I think for now we're working with our $600 million that we have pulled in from, and once we have this conversation with the UN and the partners, we'll explore to see where the needs are, and then come back and really explore what flexibilities and what support we might need from you to allow us to do that as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We certainly have a question in regard to the licensing. I have also would like to just have it clarified. The meeting that was held several days after we adjourned, but I don't know, the administrator, Raja Shaw, attended it. And many of the NGO groups were there, CARE and Oxfam, and most of them. But there was the concern at that time about the whole question of licensing. And as we know, the agencies take a lot of risk, first of all, to have an interest in still trying. I just have to commend people who put their lives in harm's way. Actually, the World Food Program, since 2008, has lost 14 workers have been killed trying to deliver life-saving food and aid to Somali civilians. And so we do have some very heroic people. I met some of them on my last trip to Mogadishu about 2 years ago when I visited there last. But for them then to worry about the license or whether their agency is going to be held liable if some of the food falls into the hands of al-Shabaab, to me, really is putting a cart before the horse. I mean, it's bad if al-Shabaab did get control of some of the food, as we have heard. However, I think that there was too much holding back or not enough, clarification to agencies who were willing to put themselves out there in harm's way, but worried about the legal consequences of if some of the food they had fell into the hands of some of the bad people. It seems to me that the overall goal should have been saving the children, saving the women, saving the people in need. However, it seems like, and Mr. Smith asked who was it, was Treasury, fooling around with whether a license could be issued or not issued. And could you explain, is that issue clear, and can the NGOs and PVOs work without worrying about if indeed something fell in the hands of some less than desirable groups, that they're going to be held accountable and prosecuted? Absolutely. I mean, they were fearful at that meeting. It was unclear, because that was several weeks ago. And I think that many lives would have been saved if we didn't fool around about a license and some food falling into the hands of the wrong people. Children were dying while we were trying to debate in court what was legal, what was not, should we allow it. We were on the Voice of America, what was a program about 3 or 4 weeks ago, where NPR, did any food fall in the hands? As the chairman, and I made it clear myself that it's unfortunate if some falls, and we hope it didn't. However, the basic goal is to try to save lives. And so I just wonder if that issue has been clarified.
Mr. Payne, I agree with you. Our commitment is about saving lives. After recently coming from my recent visit, it can't be anything other than our commitment to save lives. We're approaching this on 2 tracks, as I mentioned earlier. One is everybody who receives U.S. funding is covered by the license. The other is those who are not being funded by U.S. government. That's the ongoing discussion at the moment. So we're encouraging as many people as possible to work with us to see how we can take advantage and efficiently maximize in working with us in that regard. The ongoing discussion about the second track, about non-U.S. government funding, those discussions are being had at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, we were just chatting. People need to be assured with a legal document in hand. Agencies are still reluctant to know whether they are going to be, like I said, not only cited, but prosecuted, and fines and penalties, and I don't know if that probably we even go as far as to talk about imprisonment. I mean, seems to me that sometimes it's great to have lawyers around, but I think that, we really, and I'm not, blaming you. I'm sure you would love to, that's what you do. You give food out, you're not trying to hold it in. However, perhaps we have the wrong agency here. We really need to see if we can get through this red tape. We have currently, as it's been indicated, $604 million. Now, how does the DART team work in the countries there? Are they a separate entity, and how is that operating?
We have the DART team in Nairobi and in Addis, and their primary function is to identify and coordinate with other partner response agencies. So they work on 3 functions: how efficiently to get our resources out there, find creative partners who can help us deliver this assistance, work with host country systems to see where we can bring greater efficiency to their services, and lastly, to work with partners. It's a real rapid, real-time team that's on the ground trying to build better management of the situation.
And how has the fund raising with the other countries, like we said, I think we mentioned that the Arab League finally came in with something. What have the other? We know we did $604 million. Where did the other nations, any other large donors?
The United Kingdom, which is one of our other partners, currently is providing 115 million. The EU has committed to 300 million. So we're trying to find how best to pull all of our resources together to impact this. Each of us has our own restrictions, our own programs. So we're working, and the World Bank has committed to $500 million for disaster recovery and development. So in the next week or two, we're trying to bring all of us together and look at not only about the emergency, but also the long-term recovery efforts, where maybe we should start doing some things now that lend to a greater resiliency and recovery in the coming months.
Now, at the Dadaab camp, what is the current population? I was there about 2 years ago when I thought it was a lot of people there now, but I understand that the growth has grown by maybe 25%, 20% since that time. What is the current estimated number of people actually in the camp? And I assume that many of them can't actually physically get into the camp. So are they in the surrounding areas, and how are they serviced? Are they serviced as if, in fact, they were in the camp with rations, etc.?
The camps right now are hosting about 440,000 refugees, more than 116 of which have arrived since January. Approximately 1,500 new refugees are arriving on a daily basis. So our colleagues at the State Department are closely working with the Kenyan government about opening up the new site, the new refugee camp, to relieve some pressure off the original camp. The services are being delivered in some ways, trying to help WFP and others loosen some procedures up so that the food and the immediate services goes to these populations. So there is a full effort now to maybe be creative in a way that we not just view it as a physical camp, but led by needs and services, rather than saying somebody who's in the camp. Because the time, expecting 1,500 people a day in, it's hard for people to say where they belong in which physical location.
Just the final question or two. A number of Somalis have gone into Ethiopia, which is really great that they've opened their borders. However, as you know, in the Ogaden region of Ethiopia, the Somali population has been at odds with the central government, and I have spoken to just recently, just today in person, one of the ONLF representatives who alleged that in the Ogaden region, there is difficulty and less than a uniform delivery of relief supplies. Have you heard of any complaint of this nature at the State Department, to your knowledge, or at USAID?
I'm not aware of anything, but what I could do is check with our colleagues in Ethiopia, our mission in Ethiopia, and our state colleagues, and come back to you with some additional information on that.
All right, I really would like to have you follow up on that. And finally, I spoke to the second person in charge in Eritrea a week ago and asked about the situation there. Of course, as you know, and indicate that they have had a bumper crop last year, and they also purchased expecting a problem this year, and and I was asked to come and visit if my time permitted. Have you had any conversations with the government of Eritrea? There seemed a lack of communication with the government. I know that sometimes there's been some difficulty, but hopefully there will be some ongoing conversations between the government officials of Eritrea and the U.S. government. What is your assessment? I was told that if they needed help, they would indeed be in touch with us, so I can just take it at that word.
We don't have an AID mission in Eritrea. However, the European Union is a big partner of the Eritrean government. So a lot of our visibility into the humanitarian situation has been through our partners who have presence and programs there. What I could do is talk to our state colleagues and our colleagues, partner colleagues at the EU, to see where we can get additional information on the crops, the situation about the food.
Okay. Thank you. And really, the last question. In regard to South Sudan, there was a donor, a conference. I was really unclear, but you know that Ambassador Steinberg was going to, had a bit to do with. And of course, you know, Ambassador Steinberg is outstanding person and usually does a great job on his projects. However, I was wondering what happened to the conference that was scheduled to begin about 2-3 weeks from now.
We're committed, the administration, the president made the commitment to this international engagement conference for the new country to come to Washington and meet a variety of partners that could help them in implementing their development vision. We had talked to them about coming as a new government with a new cabinet, and they appointed their cabinet and installed their cabinet last Friday. So we thought between now and then UNGA, which is in the next 2 weeks, that they would not really have the time necessary to cohesively come with the policy vision, and we wanted them to succeed at the conference and wanted to give them an additional time to engage us on their development vision. And
Thank you. Well, we look forward to that, and
we hope to have all of you participate as well.
Great. And also, there still seems to be some confusion in parts of State Department about South Sudan not being on sanctions. So maybe you could, if you bump into anybody over a state, tell them it's a new country, you know, they're not a part of Khartoum anymore.
I'll carry
Thank
that
you.
message, sir.
Mr. Carnahan. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, again, for leading this today. Thank you for being here and for the work that you do. I wanted to follow up my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Payne's question about Deputy Administrator Steinberg. When he recently returned from the region, he indicated that emergency humanitarian response must put women front and center in the process, assuring that they address not just the victims of the current emergency, but make them part of key solutions going forward. He further stated that the U.S. is involving women as planners, beneficiaries, and recipients on programs, including an emphasis on relief to pregnant women and on projects to prevent and respond to disturbing reports of sexual violence. I want to commend the administration on making these priorities, and with women and children disproportionately vulnerable to malnutrition, disease, sexual and gender-based violence in the wake of this crisis. I think these issues are critical, but especially challenging. I'd like to hear you elaborate more on the strategy to ensure that these most vulnerable populations are supported through the recovery efforts and how they really fit into the long-term development process.
Deputy Steinberg and our agency has really made this an agenda of everything we do across all the sectors: health, education, agriculture. It's really a multi-sectoral commitment. And we work sort of at three levels. One, at the policy level in these host countries to ensure that women participate in this decision-making process. When decisions are being made about camps and about food deliveries, that there should be influencing these decisions. On my recent visit, I mean, I have seen other camps, and I've never seen a camp that is so full of women and children as I've seen in both in Ethiopia and Kenya. And sometimes it becomes a hard thing to kind of absorb at the enormity of the suffering that they face. And so we have made commitment to three levels. One is that they participate during this process and not just be recipients of assistance, because a lot of times we tend to say, oh, we treated this many women, we delivered, but our push right now is to say we need these women to participate in the decision-making process, in the policies that are made. The other big issue is access to assets, land and credit, because in any household, women make some of these decisions about children's education, food security. So we think a large part of it is making food security, having women participate in food security, in production, land, access to credit. We're working with the African Women in Agricultural Research and Development to help us think through these strategies much more, and especially in crisis situation. We have a lot of knowledge on how to deal with it in the longer term, but we really have to ramp up our efforts in these complex crises and go beyond just protection, and how can we make them productive? Because so far we deal with protection, but we also want to deal with economic viability of households, which is dependent on women at the moment.
And when you were there, share with the committee some of the impact of that involvement in terms of getting better results.
In the camp in Ethiopia, I found that the decisions around water, decisions around healthcare, were really meaningful in the way that we were able to say that how to not only survive this crisis, but let's start talking about how do we recover from it. And that provided sort of a hope, and that allowed people to be motivated, because a lot of, as the chairman and Mr. Payne have said, a lot of women made tough decisions walking to these camps, leaving children behind, and sorry.
Yeah, thank you. The other issue I wanted to ask about on my time here is on climate change. Under the generous clock of the chairman, climate change, one of the causes of the drought, what we should be doing to help mitigate the impacts of climate change on vulnerable countries. Scientific evidence suggests that extreme weather events such as flooding and drought will likely become even more severe in terms of frequency and severity around the globe, but especially in areas like the Horn of Africa. Can you talk with us about the administration's Global Climate Change Initiative, address these trends, especially in Africa, and what else we need to be doing to address those?
From an AID perspective, we deal with communities who face water shortages, who lose livestock because of lack of rain. We deal with the impact and the consequences. So one of our efforts is working with local governments. For example, in Ethiopia, before the drought, we did a commercial destocking program where that they didn't have to wait till the livestock died and lost all their asset bases. So we said, is it possible to sell off some of your livestock now, get some income, and be prepared to deal with purchasing food within a few months' time when we know that you will not be able to grow crops. The other is water management. In northern Kenya, with the pastoral community, Mr. Chairman, that you mentioned, our objective there is some pastoral communities are able to adapt and move near rivers and maybe start farming. Others aren't. So we have to, we're working on two tracks within our Feed the Future. One is how to sort of have them engage in the market, link them to the ongoing markets where food production areas to food deficit areas. And the other is give them tools to manage the resources they need to sustain their lifestyle currently. It's a very complex combination of factors of managing livestock, land, water, and that's at the community level. That's where we have worked and continue to work with in most of the Horn, at least today. And I can bring some additional information through your staff about what we're doing throughout the continent. Today I sort of focused on the East Africa, but we're willing to share that information with you.
Thank you. I'd certainly like to see that. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Carnahan. Ms. Bass?
First of all, I wanted to thank the chair and the ranking member for putting this hearing on and all the work that you've done over this year. And I especially want to thank the witness for your work, your contributions. And I've never been to one of the refugee camps, so I can't even imagine the suffering that you must have seen. You were giving some examples in regard to climate change, but I wanted to ask if maybe you had a couple of other examples about how USAID is addressing the long-term needs of the region, since we know that the cycles of drought and famine, occur recurrently. Maybe you could point out another couple of examples.
Our $3 billion of development assistance, the region is amazingly dynamic, even with the drought. It leads in terms of trade, it leads in terms of financial services, innovative mobile banking. I mean, on a development front, the regional integration platforms, the infrastructure that's being discussed between Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. I mean, it is a very vibrant economy that is in that region at the moment. So what we have said is we make a commitment to how do we create economic opportunity in that region? How do we improve governance in that region? And our investments long-term have actually helped us think through why is it that we're not, how do we mitigate? We can't avoid another drought or shortage of rain, but we can mitigate it. We can lessen the impact. We can be more responsive, as the chairman said, and quicker. Where have we learned our lessons? So we're spending an enormous amount of time with the governments themselves saying that, as Mr. Payne has said, in the 60s, 80s, 90s, we need them to commit. So our huge effort is a reform agenda with the governments to make policy commitments now so that we don't have to face the same situation over and over in the coming years. But for us, the development assistance is the long-term solution to the region. And I think that the Feed the Future, unlocking the agricultural productivity in that region is key to stability in that region, because nearly 80% of the population earns income in the agriculture sector. So productivity is our commitment, and governance is a huge commitment to the region, and regional integration, so they take advantage of it. So if there are food deficit areas and food productive areas, how do we create the markets to link them? Because we may not be able to grow food in all parts of the region, but we need to make sure that the food that is grown is viably reaching populations that can access it.
Thank you. On governance, I did want to ask you a question about that. The area that I represent in Los Angeles, there's a neighborhood that's referred to as Little Ethiopia. Yeah. And it's a commercial area, but there's a lot of Ethiopians that live in the area, and they are always talking to me about democracy and human rights, especially in wake of the 2010 elections. And, a little bit off subject, but wanted to know if you could kind of address that in terms of what we're doing to support the democratic efforts. since they will ask me when I get back.
Aid approaches this issue from two tracks. One is strengthening civil society in terms of participation, because as long as you don't have populations participating in making these choices about their future, that's always our biggest constraint. We're providing tools, we're providing instruments, but at the end of the day, you do need a population that participates. So we're working on that. The other is a much more interesting thing that we're doing in Ethiopia, actually, at local governments. We're working with the governments to say about social accountability. So whether they're delivering health services or education, we have had much better success with local governments having populations participate in those decisions. So we feel that, we try to use different platforms to get the communities participating and holding local officials accountable for those services that they've made commitments to. And that's our big effort right now in many parts of Ethiopia, working and deploying into working with regional governments. And our state colleagues continue to work on the broader governance issues in the country.
And then finally, just one last question. I know that, there will be some cuts in the next year's budget, and I wanted to know if any of the cuts that are being proposed would impact the Food for Peace and international disaster assistance, would affect your ability to respond to the current emergency, or is it something we need to take a look at again?
As of today, we don't see it, we're not experiencing it, but I think once we have this conversation on the sidelines of UNGA about where the international resources are flowing to, we have a better idea of where the gaps are, and then come back and review where our situation is.
Just a couple of bit of follow-ups, and if you could, Ms. Jandelaya, get back to us early next week to the subcommittee and update us on the progress or lack of progress on the licenses in that conversation, because it seems to me delay is denial, and if there's something, and we'll ask Treasury to come here and provide their rationale for denial of those licenses, and it seems to me that a call from the Secretary of State would do this, at least I would think. This is that urgent. So if you could let us know by early next week exactly what the lay of the land is, that would be most appreciative, and we will share it immediately with all the members of the subcommittee for sure. Secondly, if you could, there's on the Iran's PR wire, there's a story that they are now providing their 11th convoy. This one's some 40 tons of relief material, food, medicines, and the like. And this is their 11th time, so they seem to be responding for whatever reason, humanitarian or political or both. My question is, what is your take on that? Is it real? Are they really providing foodstuffs? Is this a something that is just being done for PR purposes? Secondly, with regards to the Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia has some $500 million a day in oil profits. They've provided $60 million in relief, which obviously is welcomed. But my question is, what kind of robust diplomacy is being done among our Persian Gulf allies, including Saudi Arabia, which would have, I think, the most to contribute, to meet that $1 billion gap and to do it immediately? Who's coordinating that? Are the phone calls being made, especially in light of, the excessive wealth of countries like Saudi Arabia?
On the first two, I would have to, I'll come back with additional information regarding, I'll take back your request and come back, I'll take back your request to our colleagues on the discussion about the licensing. On the issue about Saudi Arabia and the diplomatic strategy with our Gulf partners, there's an intense effort by our State Department colleagues in the region, outside the region, non-traditional donors, at every opportunity we have, at UNGA, at G20, at Busan. every international event and bilateral discussions, this topic has been raised with our partners. And that's led by our State Department colleagues. And we're working closely with them by providing them information on where and how that they could participate in this broad, large international effort, humanitarian effort. And development effort for the recovery. The other issue is some have started on recovery activity. So we're also trying, not everybody wants to deal with the immediate humanitarian. Some would like to focus on recovery issues. So we're catering to both those conversations at the moment. But there is a large, intense effort by our State Department colleagues to move this agenda forward.
Thank you. Anything further? I want to thank our Ms. Gendalaya, thank you very much for your testimony. Look forward to hearing from you early next week. Okay. And I'd like to now welcome, and again, thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to now welcome our second panel to the witness table, and I'll do the official introductions. Here it is. Beginning first with Ms. Catherine Zimmerman from the American Enterprise Institute. Ms. Zimmerman is a foreign policy analyst at AEI's Critical Threats Project. As AEI's team leader for the Gulf of Aden region, her work has focused on Al-Qaeda and its associated movements in the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Ms. Zimmerman specializes in Yemen-based group, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and Somalia's Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab. She has conducted numerous briefings for policymakers, published analyses of U.S. national security interests in Yemen and Somalia. We'll then hear from Dr. Ken Hill, who joined World Vision in February of 2011 after more than 3 decades serving in the U.S. government and in academic and nonprofit leadership roles. As head of the World Vision U.S. international programs, he collaborates with World Vision's international partners to coordinate the allocation of government grants and donations from individuals and corporations. From 2001 to 2005, Dr. Hill served as head of USAID's Bureau for Europe and Eurasia. Between 2005 and 2009, he led USAID's Bureau for Global Health, heading up their health programs and representing them in several large health initiatives. I will note that while Dr. Hill was Assistant Administrator for Global Health in the Bush administration, I asked him to administratively initiate a robust fistula program within USAID. I'm happy to say that he did so and did it wholeheartedly with a great deal of skill and compassion. Thanks to that program, USAID has dedicated nearly $60 million to address fistula between FY 2005 and 2010, and approximately 20,000 women have received fistula repair surgery since 2005, and that had he not taken that leadership role, I can tell you that would not have happened. We had passed a bill, I sponsored it, passed in the House, died in the Senate. We asked if administratively Dr. Hill could initiate that program, and he did. We're now in some 30 USAID-supported fistula repair centers, mostly in Africa, in 11 countries, and again, 20,000 women who have received repair. Then we'll hear from Ms. Shannon Schreiber of Oxfam, who has been with Oxfam since 2003 and is currently leading the humanitarian policy team in Washington, D.C. She has worked on many of Oxfam's humanitarian responses around the world, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Liberia, Ethiopia, and Somalia. She has testified previously before Congress and has been interviewed on humanitarian topics by many well-known media outlets. Ms. Schreiber began her career as a healthcare volunteer in a small rural village in Zambia. Ms. Zimmerman, if you could begin.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, Member of the Subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you today to discuss this important topic. Before I begin, I would like to direct you to a reference map of Somalia provided in an appendix to my statement. I will briefly outline Al-Shabaab's history with humanitarian assistance before going into detail about current conditions and the issue of providing humanitarian assistance in Al-Shabaab-controlled territory. Al-Shabaab's position toward humanitarian assistance has evolved over the years as hardline radical Islamists gain prominence in the group. Since mid-2009, the group has progressively banned many Western organizations, claiming that they have a Christian agenda and do not pursue the interests of the Somali people. Local NGOs also face pressure from Al-Shabaab for working with these groups. Al-Shabaab's leadership particularly targeted the UN's World Food Program. First, Al-Shabaab prohibited all branded aid, including aid with the American flag on it. Then, it required the World Food Program to only purchase food locally and to empty all food warehouses by the end of 2009. On January 1 in 2010, Al-Shabaab militants raided a World Food Program warehouse in America and burned over 300 sacks of food. The World Food Program responded by suspending its operations in the South, citing a lack of security. It has not been able to resume operations there. The experience of the World Food Program is not unique. By mid-September 2010, at least 7 other agencies were banned from Al-Shabaab's territories. The organizations that remain face restrictions on their activities, and many are subjected to some form of taxation. Al-Shabaab's actions have exacerbated the effects of the drought in the region. In early July this year, Al-Shabaab spokesman announced that, quote, all aid agencies whose objective is only humanitarian relief are free to operate, end quote. Despite this proclamation, agencies such as the World Food Program are still banned. There have been certain openings into the South. UNICEF, for example, has delivered supplies into Baidoa, the capital of Bay Region. By and large, however, Al-Shabaab remains hostile to most international aid agencies. Many Somali families, unable to survive under Al-Shabaab's rule, are fleeing. In response, Al-Shabaab has established roadblocks along primary travel routes and has forced truckloads of people to turn back. Residents have also been required to feed Al-Shabaab militants or face punishment for refusing to do so. The group publicizes its drought relief work, but the sheer number of people leaving its territory is indicative of the poor conditions and the limited access to food. It is necessary to recognize very real restrictions on humanitarian aid activities when considering the prospects of expanding operations into southern and central Somalia. First, the humanitarian operating environment is precarious, even without the presence of Al-Shabaab. There have already been attacks on aid convoys in Bay and Haran regions, during which at least 1 aid worker was killed. The only clear realized gains since the UN first deployed peacekeeping forces in 1992 have been made in Mogadishu, where a peacekeeping force assists the Transitional Federal Government, or the TFG. The African Union Mission in Somalia, or AMISOM, has a force presence of about 9,000 peacekeepers. Territory outside of the TFG and AMISOM's control is contested by armed factions, and is likely that any insertion of resources into such a volatile environment will result in violence. A significant escalation in humanitarian activities throughout southern and central Somalia will very likely increase the risk to aid workers' safety. Second, though Al-Shabaab is not the only obstacle to humanitarian relief in Somalia, it is clearly the greatest threat to aid workers. Al-Shabaab Shura Council has made clear that it will not accept the presence of many international humanitarian aid organizations, and has enforced this ban with violence. Humanitarian aid organizations are ill-equipped to deal with the threat posed to their personnel by Al-Shabaab militants, and it would be naive to ignore the security aspect of any humanitarian operation there. Third, Al-Shabaab has a very strong power base in major cities in the south, such as the ports of Merka and Kismayo. There's a high likelihood that any humanitarian operation, which would entail establishing security in the heartland of Al-Shabaab's territory, will be met with significant armed resistance. Al-Shabaab is able to operate military training camps openly and will be able to call up forces quickly. Its militias have already exhibited the ability to withstand AMISOM operations in Mogadishu, especially during its 2010 Ramadan offensive. It has taken a 50% increase in peacekeeping troops and a sustained effort by the TFG to develop its own security forces to reestablish temporary control over the majority of the capital. Whereas in Mogadishu, Al-Shabaab conducted an insurgency against AMISOM and TFG troops, in southern Somalia, Al-Shabaab is the dominant power. An armed conflict in southern Somalia will likely require the deployment of ground forces that could readily defeat Al-Shabaab. The decision to pursue a humanitarian operation in southern Somalia ought to be made with these substantial costs in mind. Opting for a humanitarian aid operation will likely require a military commitment. Seeking to purchase consent from or to cooperate with Al-Shabaab to insert humanitarian assistance incurs future costs. Purchasing consent does not guarantee future security or even the delivery of assistance to the people in need. What it does, however, is fund a virulent radical insurgent group that has stated its intentions to attack America as increasingly established ties to al-Qaeda's most operational franchise, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, across the Gulf of Aden in Yemen. Cooperating with al-Shabaab will likely permit it to dictate aid distribution, strengthening the group. A humanitarian operation to respond to the spreading famine, however morally imperative, must not be undertaken without an understanding of the full requirements and the associated risks. I thank the subcommittee for its attention.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your kind words about the work together we did on fistula and a number of other topics. I appreciate that very much. And Congressman Payne, I remember your support when I testified before this subcommittee, I believe on TB, and we managed to get some major progress there as well, so I appreciate that very much. I testify to you today on behalf of World Vision, and thank you for the opportunity of doing so. World Vision is a child-focused Christian humanitarian organization that serves the most vulnerable people in about 100 countries, and I might just add that in our calculation of the 100 countries or so, Somalia is the top of the list in terms of difficulty of a place in which to work. The World Vision International 2010 budget was approximately $2.5 billion, and the World Vision US portion of WVI raised about $1 billion of that, with 75% coming from private donations. Our supporters include 1 million donors from every state and congressional district, and we partner with more than 6,000 churches and thousands of corporations as well. With respect to the crisis in the Horn, we've been working to strengthen communities and respond to emergencies for 60 years. In 2010, World Vision served 15 million people through responses to 80 different humanitarian disasters around the world, including Haiti, the flooding in Pakistan, the severe drought in China. We've been operational in the Horn for a number of decades. This drought is the worst in the Horn in 60 years. Just a couple of days ago, the UN has warned that as many as 750,000 Somalis may die in the coming months. This is approaching the number of people who died and probably will exceed that which occurred during the 84-85 Ethiopian famine. An incredible 58% of the children in Somali's Bay region are suffering from acute malnutrition. In total, more than 12 million people are presently at risk. Their crops have died, their animals have died, and now they are dying in the tens of thousands. Half of them or more are children, many in southern Somalia, where the famine has been declared in a number of places. Many tens of thousands more will die unless the world responds in a way that's more convincing that it is now responding. World Vision is reaching out to about 2.5 million people with life-saving aid and other assistance in this particular crisis. Let me say just a word about how smart aid saves and transforms lives. While droughts are cyclical and more droughts will certainly come in the future, famines are entirely preventable with the right response. Let me insert something here. There's been a lot of discussion here today about the problems of food security and the things that the world needs to do on this, but it would be silly not to note the importance of the testimony we have just heard. In situations where there is political instability or anarchy, you're always going to have a crisis exacerbated. So droughts and famines are never going to have just rain or climate problems when you've got this kind of governance issues at work in Somalia. You read any standard history of this region, and it is frightening the degree of the complexity and the difficulty of solving that. If we don't find a way to address the governance issues in places like this, our international development attempts to help will always be severely limited. So we've got to keep that in mind. We can and we must respond, and we must respond quickly if the devastating consequences of this famine in the Horn are to be significantly reduced. Now, we know firsthand from our experience that there are things you can do that will make a difference. Throughout the Horn of Africa, World Vision has delivered water to communities whose water sources have dried up. We provided emergency nutrition to malnourished children. Our clinics in Somalia will serve people who have fled their homes or on their way to Ethiopia or Kenya. We have put up 5,000 tents in Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world, perhaps the first shelter that these Somali refugees have had in more than 30 days. Many times these people have walked for days and they're malnourished. It's sobering to think how many more people, especially children, will die if we and the world do not respond energetically and quickly. Now, this is important. Famine prevention's got to be a priority. For 2.5 decades, World Vision has worked in programs like the Marulum Irrigation Program, which has enabled families in northwestern Kenya's Turkana county to grow, eat, and sell crops. Now, I bring this up for this reason. If you compare the places that groups like Oxfam or World Vision or any of the other good organizations that do work, you look at the work they did over a long period of time, 10 or 15 years, you compare what happens during a famine, the groups that will have the famine are the ones that we have not been in a position to help. It does make a difference what we do and when we do it and to what scale we do it. Other areas that we don't touch or haven't had the resources to touch, they're the ones that are most victimized. Now let me say something about this very touchy issue of U.S. funding with respect to this. We all know this is a tough political and budget environment right now, with many Americans struggling to make ends meet and with much legitimate political attention on reducing the U.S. government debt. But reducing the U.S. budget deficit and living within our means, however much it is a moral issue to do that, and I think it is a moral issue to live within our means, it is also a moral imperative to save vulnerable children from hunger and effects of disaster when we have it within our capacity to make a difference. I insist on believing, and World Vision believes, and I know my colleagues believe this as well, we believe that we can do both. We can get our fiscal house in order, make the steps necessary to do that, and yet we can continue to fund at appropriate levels the important global humanitarian programs that we believe in. For many years, the U.S. has been and continues to be the leading donor government to humanitarian crises in the Horn. But listen to this. Our share has shrunk from approximately 53% of the world's response to the drought in 2008 to about 30% today. We are simply not playing the proportionate weight we once did just a few months or years ago to crises like this. Or consider this. The U.S. government's response to what is the worst disaster, a drought in the Horn in 60 years, is about 60% of what it was in 2008, and that concerns us. With respect to appropriation issues, this is not the time for America to pull back. It is not a time to reduce those life-saving accounts by 30% in some cases. It is a time to increase them. Disaster assistance accounts for 1/10 of 1% of our national budget, and it is highly cost-effective in terms of saving lives. They should not be cut during a time of famine. Therefore, I would request on behalf of World Vision and many of the other organizations in interaction, and in addition to submitting my full text for the record, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit that letter that has just gone out to congressional members on this point. We would request that funding be at least at the fiscal year 2010 enacted level, which means $1.85 billion for migration and refugee assistance programs, $1.3 billion for international disaster assistance, that's what funds OFTA, and $1.84 billion for U.S. food programs through PL 480 Food for Peace. I would like to include for the record, as I mentioned, that letter to the signed by over 50 non-governmental organizations asking that disaster assistance accounts be funded at these fiscal year 2000 levels. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the ranking member, Payne, for holding this hearing, for your ongoing internal advocacy within the U.S. Congress to ensure a strong and moral response to the situation in the Horn of Africa. And I look forward to your questions in a few minutes.
Dr. Hale, thank you so much. Ms. Schreiber.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Payne, thank you for this opportunity to testify today on the humanitarian situation in East Africa. Oxfam is grateful for your leadership and the work this committee has done to address the humanitarian situation in the region. Oxfam America is an international development and relief agency committed to developing lasting solutions to poverty, hunger, and social injustice. We are part of a confederation of 15 Oxfam organizations working together in more than 100 countries with over 3,000 local partners around the globe. The Horn of Africa, as we have heard, is experiencing the worst drought we have seen in 60 years. But the current crisis is also due to not heeding early warnings about the drought, the conflict in Somalia, high food prices, and the lack of investment in agriculture and programs that reduce the risk of disasters in the first place. The famine and ongoing conflict in Somalia has displaced around 1.8 million people. Thousands have fled from rural parts of Somalia into Mogadishu, while even more have walked for weeks across the desert with very little food or water in search of relief in neighboring countries. In Kenya, there are 430,000 refugees living in the camps of Dadaab, where 70 to 80% of new arrivals are women and children. In Ethiopia, there are 250,000 refugees living in Dolado, where there has been a rise in deaths among children due to measles, malnutrition, pneumonia, and diarrhea. Oxfam is working in Kenya and Ethiopia directly operational and through partners, and we are also working in Somalia, but solely through partners. We are reaching over 1 million people and aim to reach 3.5 million. Oxfam's response includes providing water and sanitation services, food aid, cash transfers where food is available, and providing livelihood support, such as rehabilitating livestock, since those predominantly affected by this drought have been pastoralists. In Somalia, Oxfam's partners are reaching over 800,000 people. While operations in South Central Somalia are extremely difficult, I have no doubt about it, it is possible to provide assistance, particularly for NGOs who have strong links to the communities with some Somali partners and who have a history of working in South Central. In the Kenya refugee camps, Oxfam is providing water and sanitation assistance to more than 64,000 people, and we are also providing water and sanitation to the 60,000 people that are sitting on the outskirts of Dadaab. The current challenges to the response include funding, access, and coordination. The U.S. government has been by far the most generous donor, but I'd just like to echo Dr. Hill's comments about the need for the U.S. government and others to do more. Other donors have also stepped up, including non-traditional donors, which we've heard a little bit about, but the needs are immense, and as has been stated, there is a $1 billion shortfall today, and we know that the needs are going to increase. Below average rainfall is predicted for the November to January rains in South and Central Somalia, which means we may not see recovery in Somalia until the next harvest in August of 2012. In terms of access, South Central Somalia is one of the world's most difficult environments to work in, yet Oxfam partners and other agencies are reaching Somalis, and providing assistance where they can. But restrictions by armed actors or donor policies that also have restrictions can hamper efforts to provide life-saving assistance. Therefore, all parties must lift restrictions and allow unfettered access to assistance in Somalia. In addition to funding and access, we need to ensure that aid reaches those most in need. Therefore, coordination, information sharing, and transparency amongst all actors must be improved. Failing to respond to the early warning systems, as has already been stated, we knew about this crisis, at least some of the early warning about La Nina was coming in August of 2010. While a massive operation is now underway, little was done until the May 2011 rains failed, as was predicted by the early warning systems. Looking forward, national governments, regional actors, and the international community, including NGOs, must do a better job of coordinating a holistic response early on if food emergencies are to be avoided in the future. And I just want to say recently we've had a series of conferences. We've had 2 FAO conferences in Rome. The African Union also had a conference. There is a conference going on in Nairobi today and tomorrow by affected countries, but why did it take this long to actually have those conferences? Looking in terms of improving access to food, a number of factors have resulted in reduced food production in the region, and in the long term, we must address constraints to agricultural productivity. However, we must immediately increase people's access to food today. With high and rising food prices, basic staples are simply not affordable for tens of thousands of people throughout the region. The majority of people in the worst affected areas have no savings and few safety nets to support them when drought or other disasters strike. Oxfam's assessments have shown that when food is available, cash-based interventions are a rapid, effective way of saving lives, supporting livelihoods, and contributing to the functioning of local markets. As we look at the way forward, we know that the Horn of Africa is highly vulnerable to natural disasters, particularly drought, which will have impacts on livelihoods and food productions. Studies have shown that investing in disaster risk reduction, which we have touched on, saved lives and money. However, global expenditure on disaster risk reduction in 2009 was only 0.5% of total annual official development assistance. Protecting core livestock herds is much cheaper than rebuilding them once they have been decimated by drought. In the Afar region of Ethiopia, restocking sheep and goats costs 6.5 times more than supplementary feeding, and restocking cattle costs 14 times more. DRR also builds community resilience. In Ethiopia, Oxfam America has a project in the south where we've implemented a small-scale irrigation project that has pumped water from a major river to community fields, enabling pastoralists to produce more grain for their own consumption and to sell on local markets. Today, this community is no longer in need of food aid, and they do not have to migrate with their livestock because animal feed is available in their community. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into a record an Oxfam paper on disaster risk reduction in the Horn of Africa that we prepared for the last FAO meeting in Rome, as well as my testimony.
Without objection, those documents will be made a part of the record and all submissions by our distinguished witnesses.
Thank you. So solutions do exist, and crises on this scale can be avoided, but we have to act early and we have to invest in the right places. Therefore, the U.S. government should use its foreign assistance and influence to echo my colleague again, maintain the humanitarian emergency accounts at the FY 2010 enacted levels and fully fund Feed the Future, because that is what has been put forward by USAID as the way to address long-term needs. Ensure majority of U.S. government assistance, both humanitarian and development, related to this current crisis reinforces resilience and reduces the risk of disaster by considering the long-term implications. Support national governments to establish stronger social protection and safety net programs, such as delivering regular food, cash, or cash vouchers. Build the resilience and productivity of pastoralists and other small-scale food producers, including implementing policies and long-term investments that focus on drought cycle management and improving access to market for smallholders. Finally, we need to ensure a strong and strategic humanitarian response in which humanitarian principles are upheld and actors are encouraged to share timely, accurate information about their activities. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Schreiber, thank you very much for your testimony. Let me just ask a couple of questions. You were here for the previous testimony, obviously, and I wonder if you might want to speak to the licensing issue, how that has hurt operations on the ground, and where you think the problem lies, or where's the bottleneck? Is it Treasury? And why has USAID, if they're pushing for this, been unable to get Treasury to change their policy?
The NGO community in general was, I think, very pleased with some of the movement in the last few days when it was announced that U.S.-funded projects would see more relief in terms of the restrictions, the fears of being held accountable if assistance somehow reached El-Shabaab or someplace else that shouldn't go. But the NGO community recognized what was left out of that written statement. And what was left out of that written statement was us, unless we happened to be implementing a U.S. government grant. And even though there have been verbal assurances to us that we needn't worry, you can imagine what a donor might think when they prepare to give a gift to Oxfam or World Vision or some other organization, and they don't know if there's going to be a problem with liability because of how difficult the environment it is in to work in. So I think our request would be that the government make it very clear, in writing that the same discretion will be given to us that has been given for U.S. government funds. Now, when you consider the amount of money that the private sector has available and is willing to put into this, this is really not a small point. And so we would like to see more guarantees put into writing that would allow us to engage. Now, it's not the only problem. I mean, we were thrown out a year ago. World Vision was expelled. And like Oxfam, we have to work with other organizations to do our work there. We do some work with the Global Fund on malaria and TB in South and South Central Somalia. So there are other times that we'll have to pull out just because of security reasons, at least to be directly involved. But at least we would not have to take into consideration the fear that we will be held liable if we can't quite manage the risk as well as we would like to.
And if I could add to that, I agree that we have seen some real improvements over the last several weeks in terms of USAID implementing partners having these waivers or as they go in, but it does get to those that do not. And Oxfam America does not take U.S. government money. So for us, we've raised $4.5 million from private, from Americans and from foundations. We cannot use that money in Somalia. It's not clear to us how we could use that money in Somalia. So our, because we're a confederation, luckily we have 15 organizations that are chipping into a pot, and we do have other organizations, other Oxfams that are providing assistance in Somalia, but our assistance is going to Ethiopia and to Kenya.
Sometime next week, we're going to be working on this between now and next week. I plan on introducing legislation that would make clear that humanitarian organizations would be excluded from USA Patriot Act concerns, which is obviously what is so important here. And if for no other reason, the administration, whatever cover they think they might need, or somebody at Treasury who thinks they need some kind of cover. I mean, we've had that same problem, as my friend and colleague, Mr. Payne, knows, with those who have, you know, like in Burma and elsewhere, find it possible to get help here, asylum, because of material support, and allegedly, or even in Iraq, where they, you know, have paid someone off in order to possibility of becoming a target of terrorism, or as payment to get a loved one out, and that is to get them to come to this country. It seems to me that sometimes our regulations borderline on absurd. Is there any estimation as to how many people might be assisted if, you know, relief?
I don't.
You want to be working with your partner in opportunity out of risk.
And I mean, and also just to provide assistance to the partners that are operating, because as I said, we're reaching 800,000 people, but we want to expand those operations. And to side of Mogadishu and Lower Shabelle. Time that NGOs and agencies that have not systems and processes where it needs to. So it's the language, they're negotiating the reality of Somalia. So the other aid organizations come in.
government of what was for the Horn drought 2008. Is that because of lack of resources, lack of combination of both, or what?
You know, to be fair to the administration, I served this administration during 8 of the biggest increase in foreign assistance funding since John F. Kennedy. And yes, the president was committed to that, and yes, we had a bipartisan consensus in Congress to address HIV and PEPFAR and malaria and the Millennium Challenge count. There was a bipartisan support for it. In the wake of 9/11, we understood that it was important. We had the luxury of being able to respond. Through no fault of its own, the present administration it's been dealt a very much more difficult hand. I don't have any doubt that the administration would like to respond, wants to respond. I think they're distracted by lots of things right now. You know, in this nasty partisan bickering that we have right now in this country, it's my hope and prayer that this is one place that we put the partisan bickering aside. I believe there is support on both sides of the aisle to deal with 0.1% of the national budget to exercise our moral responsibilities and some. I think the president's committed to this. I believe the Congress can be committed to this. We have to help the American public to understand that what they think is the situation with respect to foreign assistance is not.
Right.
Repeatedly, Gallup polls and others show that they think we spend about 1/4 of the national budget on foreign assistance. They say we should cut it down to about 10%. And then it turns out that if you combine State Department, all foreign assistance together, it's about 1%. If you get down to foreign assistance, it's much less than that. And by the time you get to these funds, you're talking about 1/10 of 1%. So we're not talking about the kind of money that's going to break the bank. Now, we're going to have to be responsible, but I think this could be an example of something we can do together. And we all should try to take credit for it together and take this one completely out of the banks of partisan bickering. It's just too important not to do it.
And if I could add on to that and I agree with all of that. The needs are growing, so we should be asking those questions, Chairman, about where is the money, what do we have left in the coffers? Is a supplemental the right thing to do? So I welcome those questions, and we will ask them ourselves. And then in the long term, we also need to look at Feed the Future, because that is what the U.S. government, USAID in particular, is saying that their response going forward in order to prevent this from happening again is going to be through Feed the Future. So then that brings into questions about development assistance overall actually being funded, because Feed the Future is part of that. So I'm concerned about not actually having the funding to do the prevention that we've talked about, to do the resilience building that's been mentioned, and the disaster risk.
Ms. Schreiber, you mentioned cash-based intervention as being
to buy that food. So if we are able to, give vouchers to those traders, food, and to the communities, or to do the cash vouchers, you can do cash for work. When people are, most vulnerable populations aren't going to be able to do that, so you need direct cash. But you could do cash for work for people that are healthier, in terms of building some of the resilience for the next time this hits. And you could also do vouchers. I think we should be looking at where food is available and looking at cash as an intervention, and then where food is not, obviously food aid is needed. I think WFP needs to do, the World Food Program needs to do a little bit a better job in determining what the pipeline looks like, where food is available and where it's not, so that as the international community can look at alternative interventions, we know the exact areas where food is available and where it's not.
Now, Ms. Gendalai mentioned there's $8 million allocated Does that seem appropriate order of magnitude to you, or seems too low in terms of
It
prioritization?
seems low. It's a good start. I think, the U.S. government does well with direct food aid, and that's really important in saving lives, of course. But if we can increase that amount, it does seem low because, again, we are hearing that. And Oxfam is doing direct food distribution, but we're also doing the cash for food. So we're looking at the communities where it works and where it doesn't work. And USAID should be doing that as well, and they may need to increase the $8 million.
I think the answer on whether there's sufficient funds being put in, for example, into the Food for Peace, the answer would be no. If you gave the same statistics as I just did for OFTA, because OFTA is what gets its money from the International disaster assistance, the fund in USDA, which provides for Food for Peace, was $1.84 billion at the end of fiscal year 10. That's what was total enacted. And the bill before us right now is 1.04. So there's a tremendous cut here in a specific food program. And here's something else that has not yet come up that I think we have to address. Look, if you look at the percentage cuts in the total of state and foreign assistance, one of the big mysteries to me is why, of all of those accounts, are the deepest cuts here? I don't get it. I mean, I know these are tough times, but even in foreign assistance and in state, that you would cut most deeply the food and the disaster funds, I think that the prioritization there, we have to address that. And if there is some negotiation between the House and the Senate on the total amount, I would suggest that the negotiations center on these particular programs that have been gutted, that are being hurt, because they were cut disproportionately. They should be restored first to the extent you can find the bipartisan consensus to do so.
No, I appreciate that very much. Thank you. One last point, and are the NGOs reaching out to Persian Gulf potential donors, especially Saudi Arabia? I mean, the $60 million could be a down payment for, what could be a very huge amount of money that they are absolutely capable of providing. They have no debt like we do. Their profits, we estimate, or it is estimated, is $500 million per day. I mean, 60 million is a portion of a day's profits in that oil-rich country. Has the NGOs ever thought of sending a joint letter to the government and to the king asking for a very serious, like $500 million?
So it's an excellent question and one that's important. I think Congressman Payne was the one to mention that the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has had a conference, and that was a very important conference, and we've seen Turkey and Saudi Arabia come forward. Oxfam actually has an office in Saudi Arabia, so we actually have outreach with donors in that part of the world, and it is a request that we're making, and it's also a request that we make to their embassies in the capitals where we work. So it's something we have been pushing for, and we will continue to push for. And in terms of Somalia in particular, their assistance is very important just because of being able to fund the agencies in those areas that are Islamic, a lot of the agencies providing assistance.
3 points. It is an interesting idea, and I would support, and I don't see why Interaction and other NGOs could not encourage the U.S. government to do it. Now, it's their role as a government in a government-to-government negotiation or, discussion to do that. But your question raises a very interesting idea that I hadn't thought about before, but I think I'm going to pursue. A few months ago, I spent 4 hours with a World Vision International executive meeting with Islamic Relief in Northern Virginia. They do several $1 million of assistance. I addressed the group. We talked about ways that World Vision and Islamic Relief could work together. And it just occurs to me that we ought to follow up on that and talk real specifically about they might be able to do some things that we can't do in some of these areas here. We talked specifically about that before, but we could also talk to them about the possibility of finding out what, if anything, they are doing to encourage Islamic governments to play a more active role, because I think it was maybe It was one of the folks here today that said it really is odd that there isn't more assistance coming from that part of the world. But I think one end of that discussion through Islamic Relief, and we have good relations with them, and I think it's worth pursuing a discussion with them.
I think that the issues about themselves have gone that route because it's a
More that I
act. That these they do behind that, supporting that.
So 7 months once they, I guess, initially said there was no drought, and then they agreed that yes, it was a drought, but you couldn't bring food. The three of you might want to mention what is the current situation, especially in central Somalia, and where and the recent disappearance. God bless you. Recent disappearance of the of Al-Shabaab from Mogadishu. What they're certainly not gone. I guess they're just away, but the whole area playing out.
The official line from the spokesman from Al-Shabaab is still that there is not a famine in Somalia, that there is a drought, but that Al-Shabaab is able to feed and help the people under its territories. And what the group has actually done is, through a news channel that it has, is when it hosts food distributions in refugee camps and displaced person camps that Al-Shabaab militants run, it will use that as promotional material and take pictures of the food aid being distributed and of the families being fed, and broadcast that throughout southern Somalia and into the diaspora as well, saying that Al-Shabaab is doing good works and this is Islamic charity at its heart, and through this and through coming together and trusting in Al-Shabaab that people can survive this drought. More broadly, however, access still remains very limited into southern central Somalia because of this denial of a crisis. And in my opinion, what has happened is that more local Al-Shabaab leaders who have greater ties to local communities and need to be more responsive to their populations have increasingly put pressure on the leadership, and actually openly put pressure on the leadership, to change its policies towards major international aid organizations, recognizing that there is a drought and that people are dying in southern and central Somalia. From what I saw, I think the first signs were really in April, where local clan leaders told local Al-Shabaab officials that if they did not permit food assistance in now, that people would die later. And it's later and people are dying, and I don't think that Al-Shabaab has fully recognized the effect that this has had on its public perception within the Somali population. Thank you.
Okay. There was I don't know whether World Vision has tried it, but there was at one point a move to attempt to have some of the Somali community here, particularly in maybe Minnesota, to try to get word to the some of the Al-Shabaab leadership that they ought to reconsider their policies. Have any of you worked with the local Somali community and attempted to get them to try to persuade the Al-Shabaab people to have a different
in that exact role. And so it's something we are discussing and something we are considering doing. But at a point, what Mr. Zimmerman said, but also to your question, the diaspora could potentially help, but it's really the communities where the partners, Oxfam partners and other agencies that are operating on the ground are working, who are that defense for organizations. If you get that community buy-in, and if the community protects the aid projects, then they're the ones to put the pressure on the local leaders. So our first defense, and through our partners and working on the ground, are the communities themselves.
Have your agencies have worked with partners that have been able to get into Eritrea? Is Oxfam? How have you found the situation?
I don't have a lot of information about Eritrea. Oxfam does have programs in Asmara and in southern Eritrea, but the operations are limited and we have very few staff, so we don't get a lot of information coming out of Eritrea. But in Tigray and in northern Ethiopia, we are seeing people that are crossing the borders that have been affected by the drought, and we have heard stories about livestock that have died. So from the information we're getting in the Tigray region, there's the drought. People seem to be affected by the drought in Eritrea as well.
Mm. And Somalis are going into Ethiopia, and I know that they're allowing them in, which is good, humanitarian, although Ethiopia is having its own problems with its own drought situation, so it's really complicated. And then, of course, on the long-term problem, as I mentioned before, the Ogaden region, which is a whole separate issue for decades, tends to be having its own kind of a situation. So on one hand, the Ethiopian government is embracing people coming into their area, even though they're having a difficulty with the drought. But then on the other hand, you hear in another area that it's not working. So I guess we have to continue to just do the best we can and try to keep the pressure on. But let me just commend all three of you for the outstanding work that each of your organizations continue to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. If I could just, one final question to Ms. Zimmerman. In your testimony, you say the group, there are reports that school-aged children have been forced to attend sessions with al-Shabaab officials to receive either religious or military training. And we know that Joseph Kony, Charles Taylor have relied past tense in Taylor's case, on children to do some horrific things to other people, violence. And I'm wondering, how widespread is that, child soldiers? Do we know?
From what I've seen, actually, the use of child soldiers is prolific on both sides in Somalia. Al-Shabaab conscripts the children from regions that it controls, but there are indications that the transitional federal government has used child soldiers in the past, and it says that it's trying to take efforts to ensure that they are of proper age before enrolling young boys into its programs to train them as soldiers. However, I think that Somalia and the U.S. could look further into the issue of the use of children.
Thank you for your leadership, for your testimony, for us, and I think and look forward to working with you going forward.